The F-35 was supposed to be invisible. Stealth technology, sensor fusion, fifth-generation dominance. Every briefing, every budget request, every Pentagon press conference hammered the same narrative. Invisible, untouchable, game-changing. But here's what the defense contractors never advertised. The F-35 didn't make air superiority invisible. It made air superiority irrelevant. This isn't another video about low observable radar cross-sections or why the F-35 can penetrate contested airspace. Thousands of channels already break down the sensor suite, the engine specs, the kill-to-loss ratios. What nobody talks about, what the defense establishment actively avoids discussing, is this. The F-35 fundamentally changed what winning an air war actually means. And that shift has already broken entire air defense systems before they ever fired a shot. In 2024, the Israeli Air Force did something that should have been impossible. They conducted sustained air operations over a nation with the third most sophisticated air defense network in the world. Not a quick raid, not a surgical strike. Sustained, repeated, for months. The system they were facing, Iranian air defenses, had spent 3 decades of isolation developing Russian-origin radars, surface-to-air missiles, and integrated command networks specifically designed to counter American air power. The system worked perfectly. It was dense, it was layered, it was tactically sound. It was also completely obsolete. Not because of stealth alone. That's the lie. The real reason sits deeper, in a concept that military tacticians call information dominance without dominance. The F-35 doesn't defeat enemy air defenses by being invisible to their radars. It defeats them by being invisible to their decision cycle. Think about how an older air defense network operates. A radar detects an aircraft. That signal gets processed. A command center analyzes the contact. They communicate up the chain. A firing authority makes a decision. They transmit the order back down. The air defense battery receives clearance and launches. That entire cycle, detection to launch, takes minutes, sometimes longer if the chain of command is fragmented across different military branches or subordinate units. An F-35 operates on a completely different timeline. The F-35's sensor suite doesn't just collect data about enemy air defenses. It fuses that data in real time with information from other F-35s, from AWACS platforms, from ground-based radar networks, and from intelligence satellites. A single aircraft in the formation detects a radar turn-on. That information, not a voice report, not a radio transmission, but raw, processed intelligence, flows instantaneously across the entire network. Every pilot in the formation immediately knows the exact location, the exact radar frequency, the exact missile system type, and the exact moment that system became a threat. They don't need to wait for orders. They don't need to request clearance. They already have the information the command center just learned about. So here's what happens next. While the enemy air defense battery is still waiting for the order to fire, while their communication lines are still processing the initial detection, the F-35 formation has already executed evasive maneuvers, dumped chaff, or launched a counterstrike against the radar site itself. The enemy's decision cycle has been rendered irrelevant. This wasn't a theoretical advantage. It was demonstrated repeatedly. During the Israeli operations in 2024, Iranian air defense units would turn on their radars, trying to establish targeting solutions. By the time they transmitted a launch order, the threat had already moved. By the time they repositioned, the aircraft were already being tracked by a different sensor. By the time they attempted to launch, electronic warfare jamming had degraded their accuracy to the point of irrelevance. The Iranian command couldn't even get a shot off. Not because their missiles weren't good, not because their radar operators were poorly trained. They lost the war because they lost control of the timeline. And this is the part that should terrify every military strategist on the planet. The technology that created this advantage is now spreading. South Korea operates F-35s. Japan operates F-35s. The entire NATO alliance has begun integration of F-35s into their air defense networks. Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, they're all getting the aircraft. They're all being wired into the same sensor fusion ecosystem. But here's the strategic trap. Once you've understood how the F-35 actually works, once you understand that it's not about invisibility, it's about temporal dominance, you realize that every traditional air defense architecture in the world is vulnerable to the same attack pattern. It doesn't matter if you're facing one F-35 or 50. The vulnerability isn't in your radar. The vulnerability is in your command and control. A single modern network-centric aircraft can defeat a legacy air defense system simply by accelerating the enemy's decision cycle until their command structure breaks under the strain. They'll be making decisions faster and faster, getting incomplete information, contradicting earlier orders, creating chaos in their own ranks. Russia discovered this in Ukraine. They lost air superiority not primarily to superior aircraft, but to the moment when Ukrainian forces got access to better sensors and real-time data networks. Suddenly, old Soviet-era air defenses that hadn't changed in decades became effective again. Not because they got better, but because they got faster information. That same principle is playing out in the Pacific right now. China's air defense architecture is among the most sophisticated in the world. It's integrated. It's redundant. It's designed with lessons learned from every conflict of the last 2 decades. But every analyst worth their credibility agrees on one point. If conflict erupted tomorrow, that entire system would face an opponent operating on a completely different decision timeline. The F-35 didn't change air warfare by becoming invisible. It changed air warfare by making invisibility meaningless. It shifted the entire competition from the physical realm, raw speed, altitude, radar cross-section, into the information realm. Who sees first? Who processes fastest? Who decides quickest? That's the real revolution, and almost nobody is talking about it. The implications cascade outward in directions that defense planners are still trying to wrap their heads around. If temporal dominance matters more than physical dominance, then the entire structure of air defense, massive, fixed, predictable radar sites designed to track and engage threats over hundreds of kilometers, becomes a liability rather than an asset. Your radar turns on. Everyone sees it. Your communication line gets jammed, your firing authority gets delayed, your missiles launch 10 seconds too late. Against a network-centric opponent, the old model of defensive depth and layered threats stops working. You can't win by having more missiles. You can't win by having better radars. You can't even win by having perfect positioning. You can only win by having a decision cycle that's faster than your enemy's. And that's a problem that money alone can't solve. You can spend $50 billion building the fanciest air defense system in the world, but if your command structure is still organized for decisions that take minutes, you're already defeated by an opponent whose decisions take seconds. This is why every peer competitor nation is frantically restructuring their military command authority right now. China is decentralizing. Russia is doing the same. The entire concept of battlefield authority is shifting from centralized generals making deliberate decisions to distributed commanders making instantaneous ones. It's organizational chaos dressed up as military modernization. It's also probably going to get a lot of people killed the first time it's tested in actual combat, because the learning curve for operating effectively in this new temporal domain is steep, and the margin for error is non-existent. The F-35 didn't make air superiority invisible, it made obsolete air superiority a death sentence. And the race to figure out how to operate effectively in a world where the decision cycle is the primary battlefield is only just beginning. That's a resource we've put together in the description and pinned to the top comment that goes much deeper into how these modern decision systems are structured and why legacy militaries are struggling to adapt. But here's what nobody talks about when they discuss the F-35 or any fifth-generation fighter. The real vulnerability isn't in the aircraft itself, it's in the human systems managing it. A pilot flying an F-35 is receiving information that's being processed through 17 different decision layers before it reaches the cockpit. Satellite data, ground radar, other aircraft sensors, electronic warfare interceptors, cyber intelligence, all of it converging into a single tactical picture that the pilot is supposed to understand and act on in milliseconds. The human brain wasn't designed for that workload, not even close. Military neuroscientists have been studying this problem for the last decade, and what they've found is genuinely disturbing. Experienced F-35 pilots, and we're talking about people with 15-20 years in the cockpit, are reporting cognitive overload at the exact moment when they need perfect clarity. The aircraft is processing information faster than the human operator can absorb it. So what happens? The pilot defaults to older decision-making patterns, instinct, muscle memory, gut feeling. And in a high-threat environment against an opponent who has spent years studying your cognitive limitations, that default mode becomes your kill zone. The US military knows this, they've known it for years, which is why they've been investing billions into something that almost nobody outside of the defense industry understands: cognitive augmentation systems. These aren't science fiction concepts. They're being deployed right now. Artificial intelligence running in real time alongside the pilot, filtering out irrelevant data, highlighting threats before they become visible to the human eye, and most critically, making micro-recommendations about what action to take next. The pilot thinks they're flying the aircraft. In reality, they're flying in partnership with a system that's processing information at a speed the human brain literally cannot match. Now take that concept and scale it up. The F-35 is just one platform in an integrated kill chain that extends from satellites in orbit to submarines underwater to cyber warfare nodes in private data centers that technically don't exist. Every single one of those platforms is swimming in the same information ocean. Every single one is trying to process data faster than the others, and every single one has humans in the decision loop who are fighting harder and harder just to keep up. That's where the real arms race is happening, not in the technology itself, but in who can solve the human problem first. The Chinese Air Force has recognized this. They've completely restructured their training protocols. Instead of teaching pilots to make independent decisions, they're training them as part of a collective network. Individual consciousness is being replaced by network consciousness. One pilot might be flying the aircraft, but 15 people across the command structure are feeding information and recommendations into their decision space simultaneously. It sounds like it should create chaos. Instead, it creates something much more dangerous: predictability at scale. When you've trained your entire force to respond to the same informational inputs in the same way, you become incredibly efficient. You also become incredibly vulnerable to anyone who understands your pattern recognition systems, which is exactly why Russia and the United States have both massively expanded their cyber warfare capabilities. They're not trying to destroy networks anymore. They're trying to corrupt the information flowing through them, plant false data, create ghost contacts, make the enemy see threats that don't exist. A pilot acting on corrupted data is more dangerous than no pilot at all. The US Navy experienced this firsthand during a classified exercise in 2023. Details are still mostly classified, but what leaked through defense contractor reporting channels tells a story that explains why the Pentagon is fundamentally rethinking how they're going to operate in future conflicts. During the exercise, cyber warfare operators successfully corrupted the data feeds of an entire carrier strike group for approximately 43 seconds. 43 seconds. In that time, the integrated air defense system began targeting friendly aircraft. The ship-to-ship communication network started broadcasting false hull positions. The Combat Information Center had no reliable way to determine what was real and what wasn't. They recovered in under a minute. But that 1-minute recovery window exposed something critical. The entire foundation of modern naval warfare is built on the assumption that the data is trustworthy. When that assumption breaks, everything breaks. And here's what keeps senior military planners awake at night. There's no reliable way to rebuild trust in the data once it's been corrupted. You can patch the vulnerability. You can upgrade the encryption. You can implement 17 layers of authentication. But you can never, ever fully restore the certainty that was there before the attack. That uncertainty ripples through the entire decision cycle. Pilots become more cautious. Commanders hesitate. Response times lengthen, and in an environment where milliseconds determine who lives and who dies, that hesitation is often fatal. This is why the military concept of data dominance has completely replaced the older concept of air superiority. You don't win wars anymore by controlling the sky. You win them by controlling the narrative of what's happening in the sky. The side that can inject uncertainty into the enemy's information ecosystem wins. The side that can maintain absolute confidence in their own data wins. It's information warfare camouflaged as kinetic warfare. The implications are staggering. It means that future wars might be decided entirely in the cyber domain before a single aircraft is ever launched. It means that the traditional definition of first strike has been completely rewritten. A cyber attack that corrupts an entire nation's military data architecture isn't just a preliminary skirmish anymore, it's potentially a war-winning move. Israel has already demonstrated this capability against Iran. The Stuxnet virus that was discovered in 2010 was deployed years earlier. It infected Iranian nuclear enrichment facilities and caused centrifuges to spin at speeds that physically destroyed the hardware, while the operators thought everything was running normally. The operators had no idea they were looking at falsified data. They believed they were successfully enriching uranium when they were actually watching their entire nuclear program destroy itself. That's the future of warfare. Not missiles, not fighter jets, but the ability to make your enemy's perception of reality so unreliable that they can no longer make confident decisions. The F-35, the Chinese J-20, the Russian Su-57, all of these aircraft are becoming increasingly irrelevant as the war moves into the information domain. They're still expensive, still lethal, but they're becoming tools deployed by forces that are primarily winning or losing in the invisible spaces between the data streams. And the training infrastructure that's being built right now, in 2024 and 2025, is designed for that kind of warfare. Not to create better pilots, but to create better information processors who happen to be in the cockpit of an aircraft. The question that the Pentagon is grappling with now is whether humans should even be in the loop anymore. If the real warfare is happening at the speed of networks, why keep humans in the decision cycle at all? That question has no good answer yet, because the moment you remove the human entirely, you lose something irreplaceable: accountability, moral reasoning, and the ability to adapt to situations that were never in the training data. The F-35 represents the uncomfortable middle ground. It keeps the human in the loop, but it subordinates human judgment to algorithmic guidance. The pilot is no longer the decision maker. The pilot is the executor of decisions made by a fusion engine that processes information faster than human cognition can follow. And that has profound implications for how wars actually play out in practice. In the 2024 Middle East escalations, we saw this play out in real time. Israeli F-35s were operating in contested airspace where Syrian and Iranian air defenses were actively hunting them. Traditional fighter pilots would have relied on radar warning receivers, basically bells and whistles that alert you when a radar is painting your aircraft. But the F-35 doesn't work that way. Instead of just hearing a warning tone, the pilot sees the entire threat picture integrated into his tactical display. He sees where the radar is. He sees the location of the missile launcher that controls that radar. He sees the distance between himself and the threat. He sees the optimal escape route. He sees which other F-35s in his formation can provide suppressive fire. He sees the timing window in which he can safely execute a strike mission while remaining undetected. All of this information is being processed and presented to him in less than a second. What this means in tactical terms is that the F-35 pilot is not making decisions based on instinct or experience anymore. He's making decisions based on what the network is telling him is safe and what it's telling him is lethal. And here's where it gets genuinely unsettling. The network can be wrong. A radar signature can be spoofed. False targets can be injected into a data stream. Enemy artificial intelligence can feed deliberate misinformation into the fusion engine. And if the pilot trusts that data completely, which training now incentivizes him to do, then he can be maneuvered into making catastrophic mistakes. This is what military theorists call a data corruption kill chain. You don't need to shoot down the F-35. You just need to make it believe something that isn't true, and the pilot will do the rest. In 2023, the Pentagon declassified reports indicating that Russian intelligence had attempted exactly this kind of attack on NATO communication networks. They didn't try to destroy the systems. They tried to corrupt them. They tried to inject false sensor data to see if they could trick Allied aircraft into behaving in ways that would expose them to air defense fire. It never worked according to the official record. But the fact that it was attempted reveals the strategy. Win the invisible war over data before you ever fire a shot. This is why the next generation of air superiority is not going to be determined by who has the fastest jets or the longest range missiles. It's going to be determined by who has the most resilient, most adaptive, most trustworthy data fusion system. And that's where things get complicated. The F-35 was designed and built by Lockheed Martin, with major components supplied by Northrop Grumman and several other contractors. That consortium structure means the aircraft's source code, its algorithms, its sensor integration logic, all of it is fragmented across multiple defense contractors, each with their own security protocols, their own supply chains, their own vulnerabilities. From an operational standpoint, this redundancy is actually useful. If one contractor's systems are compromised, the entire aircraft isn't automatically exposed. But from a strategic standpoint, it creates a nightmare scenario for adversaries. Multiple entry points into a system that controls the most advanced military aircraft in the world. In 2022, there were reports, still partially classified, The Chinese intelligence had acquired detailed blueprints of F-35 avionics systems. Whether those blueprints were obtained through industrial espionage, insider threats, or deliberate leaks from contractors remains unclear, but the implications are stark. If an adversary knows exactly how your data fusion engine works, they know exactly how to fool it. This is the real vulnerability of the F-35 ecosystem. It's not that the aircraft itself is inferior. It's not that the pilot isn't skilled. It's that the entire system, the sensors, the communications, the data processing, the algorithms that transform raw information into tactical guidance, all of it has multiple potential failure points, and those failure points are now visible to nations that have invested heavily in reverse engineering and understanding how these systems work. There's a resource in the description that goes much deeper into the supply chain vulnerabilities in modern military aviation, if you want to understand exactly where and how these systems could unravel. But here's what most people miss about the F-35, and why it's still considered the most capable fighter in the world, despite all these vulnerabilities. It's not actually designed to fight alone. The aircraft is a node in a much larger network. It's a sensor platform that feeds information into a system of systems. Its primary role in modern combat is not to outmaneuver enemy fighters. Its primary role is to see further, see clearer, and relay that information faster than the enemy can process and respond to it. In military doctrine, this is called network-centric warfare. And the F-35 was the first fighter jet ever built with the understanding that it would be operating in that kind of environment from day one. A traditional fighter jet, even a very advanced one like the F-15 or the F-16, was built with the assumption that it would operate relatively independently. It had its own radar, its own sensors, its own decision-making capability. Other aircraft in the formation might be nearby, but they were not integrated into a single unified tactical picture. The F-35 changed all of that. Every sensor, whether it's on an F-35, an early warning radar, a satellite, a naval ship, or even a forward observer on the ground, contributes raw data to a central fusion engine. That fusion engine runs algorithms that synthesize all that information and create a picture of the battlefield that no individual pilot or commander could ever construct on their own. Then that picture gets distributed back to every participant in real time. Every F-35 pilot sees not just what his aircraft sensors are telling him, but what every other sensor in the network is seeing. He sees the threat picture as a unified whole. This capability is so profound that it fundamentally changes how air combat is supposed to work. In traditional fighter jet combat, the pilot with the better radar, the better visual acuity, or the better situational awareness had an advantage. The pilot who could see the enemy first could usually win the engagement. But with network-centric warfare and the F-35's integration into that network, the concept of first to see changes completely, because in theory, the entire network sees everything simultaneously. The advantage shifts from having the best individual sensors to having the most trustworthy, most integrated data fusion system. The advantage becomes information architecture rather than aeronautical performance. And that's a revolution in air combat doctrine that most people don't fully appreciate. The F-35 doesn't just change the rules of engagement, it fundamentally rewrites who gets to make life and death decisions, and when those decisions actually get made. In older air combat systems, the pilot was the ultimate decision maker. The pilot saw the target, the pilot calculated the intercept, the pilot pulled the trigger, information flowed into the cockpit, and from the cockpit came the order to fire. Everything was sequential, compressed into seconds. But with the F-35 as a node in a network, that authority becomes distributed. A pilot might be 50 miles away from a target they're engaging. They might not visually see the threat. They're flying based on fusion data that originated from a completely different sensor platform. A ground-based radar station 200 kilometers away detected it. A satellite overhead confirmed the target location. A drone patrolling another sector reported movement. All of that data converged in the F-35 systems, and the pilot acts on information they didn't personally collect. That's not just a tactical advantage, that's a fundamental restructuring of battlefield decision-making. And here's where it gets darker. When you distribute decision-making authority across a network, you create a scenario where no single person feels fully responsible for the outcome. The pilot didn't collect the initial intelligence. The ground commander didn't pull the trigger. The signals intelligence operator who detected the target wasn't the one who authorized the strike. responsibility becomes diluted across the entire system. That has enormous implications for accountability. If a target turns out to be civilian infrastructure instead of a military installation, who's responsible? The pilot who trusted the data, the commander who authorized the strike, the intelligence analyst who misidentified the target. In network-centric warfare, responsibility gets fragmented across so many decision points that it becomes almost impossible to hold anyone meaningfully accountable. And that's something that air forces and defense ministries don't really want to talk about in public. But the most revolutionary aspect of the F-35 as a network node isn't the technical capability, it's the strategic implication. For the first time in military aviation history, you have a fighter jet whose primary value isn't its individual performance. An F-35 by itself is honestly a mediocre air superiority platform. Its turning radius isn't exceptional, its acceleration isn't world-class, its raw sensor capability can be matched by dedicated ground-based systems. But an F-35 as part of a larger ecosystem, that's where the power emerges. This creates a fundamental shift in military acquisition strategy. Countries that previously competed based on building the fastest jet or the most maneuverable fighter now have to compete based on building the most integrated network. The jet itself becomes secondary to the system it plugs into. And that's why the F-35 program cost $3 trillion, and why every NATO ally, every Pacific partner, and every country that wants to maintain strategic relevance has ordered dozens of them. It's not because individual pilots love flying them, it's because the network they create is strategically decisive. The implications extend far beyond air combat doctrine. When air forces integrate around network-centric architecture, they become dependent on the technology that enables that network. They become dependent on satellite communications. They become dependent on ground-based command and control infrastructure. They become dependent on allied systems that feed data into their network. That creates massive strategic vulnerability. If an adversary can disrupt the network, even temporarily, they don't need to defeat the F-35s themselves, they just need to blind the system that connects them. Suddenly, those fighters that were operating as a unified swarm revert back to individual platforms trying to make decisions with incomplete information. Their advantage evaporates in seconds. That's why electronic warfare capabilities have become as militarily important as the jets themselves. That's why countries are now investing billions in cyber operations against military networks. That's why the next great air combat engagement might not be won by the side with the best planes. It might be won by the side that can protect its information architecture. The F-35 represents a specific moment in military evolution where technology reached a threshold that changed the fundamental nature of warfare. Not because of raw performance metrics, but because it enabled something that previous systems couldn't, the weaponization of information itself. In traditional military terms, you win by being faster, stronger, more maneuverable. In network-centric warfare, you win by having better information, faster decision cycles, and tighter integration with your allies. The jet is almost incidental. It's the vehicle that carries your network advantage into three-dimensional space. And that's why understanding the F-35 requires understanding far more than aerodynamics and weapons systems. It requires understanding information theory, systems engineering, organizational structure, and geopolitical dependency. It's why the F-35 program remains one of the most consequential military initiatives of the 21st century, regardless of whether individual jets ever actually engage in combat. There's a detailed breakdown in the description and pinned comment that walks through the actual technical specifications of how F-35 network integration works, the specific communication protocols, and the countries that are most dependent on this architecture. If you want to understand the deeper technical layer, check that out. The bigger strategic question, though, is what happens when this network breaks? What happens when an adversary becomes sophisticated enough to disrupt the flow of information that makes the F-35 lethal? What happens when network advantage becomes network vulnerability? That's a scenario that every Air Force built around network-centric doctrine is quietly planning for. And it's a scenario that's becoming increasingly plausible as drone technology, electronic warfare, and artificial intelligence continue to evolve. If you want to understand the specific vulnerabilities of network-dependent warfare systems and how militaries are actually preparing for a potential network collapse, I've put together a comprehensive resource in the channel description and pinned comment that goes into the tactical, operational, and strategic implications. You'll understand not just how the system works, but how it fails. Because ultimately, The F-35 story isn't really about aviation. It's about how modern militaries think, how they integrate technology, how they distribute authority, and how they've built an entire ecosystem of warfare around the assumption that networks will always function, enemies will always behave predictably, and that information will always flow in the directions they expect it to. When those assumptions break, and in actual warfare they always do, the entire system has to recalibrate, and that recalibration is where the real vulnerability lives. The most dangerous military advantage is the one you don't think you need to defend. And in network-centric warfare, that's the network itself. Thanks for watching this breakdown of how the F-35 fundamentally changed air combat doctrine and created a new category of strategic vulnerability that most people don't see coming. If you found this useful, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a real-time tactical analysis or military systems deep dive, and activate the notification bell right now because